Hello and welcome. My name is Andrea Stick. I'm the Community Horticulture Outreach and Master Gardener Program Coordinator for OSU Extension in Wasco County. Thank you for joining me to learn about raised bed gardening today. I want to remind you that this presentation will cover the very basic skills of raised bed gardening. If you are an experienced gardener, this may not be appropriate for your knowledge level. First thing we want to think about is establishing a successful garden can be a challenge in many urban and rural areas. So why are we even thinking about raised beds? It can be really difficult to find a suitable site with proper soil conditions. Homes are not always built on soils with desirable agriculture characteristics, and many soils are adversely modified by home construction. Vegetable gardening is difficult at best under these conditions, and gardeners soon are oftentimes discouraged by the difficulty of preparing an adequate seed bed. So what we want to think about is, why do you want to garden? What is your reason for looking into this? Are you looking to grow vegetables? Are you looking to grow flowers? Are you wanting to grow a lot of one type of thing for possibly canning, such as growing a bunch of tomatoes, and that's your goal? So kind of figuring out what your goal is going to help you determine if raised beds are right for you. And then looking at your site and determining where you can place them is also going to be helpful. If you need more information on determining what a good site is, we did review that last week in our beginner gardening course, and that was recorded and is on our website. If you need that link, please feel free to email me. So determine why you want to garden and what you want to grow, and then let's figure out how to make it happen for you. So let's look at the next thing. What is a raised bed? So for centuries, crops in many parts of the world have been produced on modified soils in elevated growing areas between walkways. This raised bed technique has been adapted to smaller areas and can be a viable solution to the problems we face with poor soil conditions. And then raised beds filled with a high quality soil mix are also a good alternative for sites that may have heavy metal or other soil contamination. So raised beds can simply be a shaped soil mound, or they can have a framing structure around them to contain the soil. So there are pros and cons to both types of this. The unframed beds are less expensive. They do oftentimes have issues and are prone to erosion, and they can oftentimes take up a larger footprint on your ground. So framed raised beds are oftentimes more space efficient, but they do require additional materials, cost, and labor when implementing them in the beginning. So first, let's talk about the preparing the mounded raised beds. These are the unframed beds. So in this image, you will see some of the steps that you need to take. So you want to first select that garden site. And then just thinking about how much work this is going to take. Do you have a tiller? Do you have the tools? So unframed raised beds usually require a great deal of spading and raking, and sometimes over a number of years this is needed to make it be a really good structure. And with erosion, you sometimes will have to every year reform those beds. But the following method that we're going to talk about permits a good garden production in usually the first year after a relatively simple soil modification process. So if you have a soil that is compacted, an initial rototilling is helpful, even if it's just the top 2 to 3 inches. You don't want to rush this step though. You want to make sure that the soil is dry enough to crumble easily, and you don't want to turn it into large chunks and cause more compaction issues. So then in order to create a mound, you will need to add some additional soil, organic material, or both. So oftentimes people will spread 2 to 3 inches of organic material over that rototilled soil, and that will help. And then another option is to actually shovel the walkway areas. And so in between each mound, you would shovel that onto the mound to kind of create flat walking spaces between. And usually you want your mound to be at a minimum 6 inches deep. And so looking at this method, there are some steps, and getting it done right is really important. If you want the detailed graph on this, we'll definitely have the publication that this image came from listed at the end. Adding excavated soil to the top beds, unless you use composted product, a mixture that contains composted manure or chemically fortified planting mix, you will need to supply nitrogen. So just thinking about that. And then oftentimes after you've amended the soil, we do recommend that you do a soil test to kind of figure out where your nutrient levels are now that you've done so much adjusting. So in step 3, we're going to rototill to a depth of about 6 inches to mix in that organic material and that soil that was already pre-existing and any of the fertilizer that you may have added in for your initial planting. Spading does accomplish the same objective, but using the tiller does make the job less backbreaking, and usually the results are a little more uniform. So that is especially true in heavy clay soils. Then we're going to look at shaping the beds. So you use a shovel or a rake to shape the beds, usually 48 inches wide at the bottom is common, but you can choose whatever width is best for your situation. And then you want to create a soil and organic mix about 8 inches deep. And for this, you're going to have a sufficient amount of rooting depth. That's why you want it to be a minimum of 6 to 8 inches. Preferably 8 if possible. When the elevated area is raked level, the natural slope of the soil will leave it about 36 inches on the top of that flat planting space. And then the bottom is going to be that 48 inches wide. So there's where you see it does take a little bit more space on your property. And then step 5, we're going to look at mulching the areas between the beds to reduce the amount of weeds and to provide you that walking space. So as you can see in this image, they have done that in between their mounds on both sides. So then let's move into looking at preparing framed raised beds. The retaining wall or framed raised beds are useful to create special shapes. As you can see here, we have the spiral on the left-hand side of my slides. And they are also used to create accessible garden beds if you're needing something that's raised a little higher and allows a wheelchair to come under, or for just more efficient use of space compared to your unframed beds. So the first thing you want to do is determine your needs. How tall do you need the bed to be? How wide do you want the bed to be? You want to make sure you can easily access the plants at the center of the bed. So if you get them too wide, you don't want to have to be stepping in your bed to do a lot of the work, because that will also cause compaction. So just making sure you can reach all areas where you have plants. And then, does your bed need to be accessible to children or individuals with limited mobility issues? So thinking about all of these things, we'll give some general recommendations of the typical dimensions that we see for raised beds. But as you can see throughout my slides, you can do pretty much anything with a raised bed if you have the imagination to do it. So standard raised beds are typically 6 to 8 inches deep. You can build them taller to accommodate more limited mobility gardeners. And then beds greater than 6 inches do oftentimes require some support. The width, you want your beds to be roughly 4 feet or less if you're going to be accessing it from both sides. If you're only going to be accessing it from one side, maybe it's up against a building or a house, you want to probably limit that to 2 feet. And then the aisles between your beds, you can accommodate this based on your needs and your preferences. Most public gardens do try to accommodate for wheelchairs, wheelbarrows, lawnmowers, making it through those spaces. So just be cognizant of that when you're making your plans. And then your length can be variable. You will see standard, usually 4, 6, 8 foot beds, depending on what you want and how big your space is. You can kind of make those decisions about your property. Most people build square or rectangle beds, but other shapes will work as well. So when we're looking, the next thing you want to consider your site and the plan for your bed. So your framed raised beds can be placed closer together than unframed beds, but you'll still need to incorporate those walkways and making sure you're allowing for that equipment. You do want to consider your plans for watering the bed as well. So setting up inline irrigation systems as easily at this step before you have added your soil, because it can be a little bit difficult once that soil is in there, or at least having a plan and knowing at what level and when you need to put it in, or at least having all the parts and having the big picture together is a really good idea before you get too far into the process. And consider your site preparation, where the bed will be located. If there's already heavy vegetation in the area, trees, shrubs, other things that may shade it out, trying to remove those may be possible, or just choosing a site that doesn't have as many of those concerns. And then we want to look at what kind of materials can we use. So various materials can be used to construct raised beds. When choosing a framing material, you really want to consider your end use. For edible crops, like vegetables, choosing a material that won't leach chemicals into the soil is really important. So you want to avoid railroad ties, older pressure treated wood that may contain different types of chemicals. Definitely just do your research about the materials that you're using. So some local available wood that could be used, cedar and redwood are more expensive, but are long lasting choices. And then you have plastics that are recycled. You have the composite decking. Some people use vinyl, stone, bricks, blocks. You can actually pour concrete ones if you have the ability to do that. But thinking about those things may affect the soil pH, so just be cognizant, especially if you're using limestone or specific types of stone that may be known for causing pH issues. And then of course you could just do the mounded earth option if you're really trying to eliminate the amount of materials that you need. So if we want to look at this picture is some rocks that were just formed in a shape that was lovely, and then the soil was added in. Then you can look at other materials to add height and vertical growing space as well. So once you've marked out your area and you build your raised bed, frame beds can be as simple or as decorative as you wish, but keep in mind the framing material needs to support the weight of the soil, the plants, and the irrigation water. So beds that are longer than 6 feet or taller than about 18 inches should be reinforced. So as you can see in the right-hand picture, they have reinforced the corners with some metal brackets, and so that can be important. And then using cross cable, anchor stakes, or other mechanisms, it helps prevent the weight of that soil from pushing the boards outwards or from just maybe falling apart eventually. So just being mindful of the support system that you need is really important as well. One of the big questions that we always get asked is filling the beds. So the next step here, that's what we're going to look at. They do recommend that you purchase or prepare a soil mix with high organic matter. When using soil mixes, good landscaping companies will offer separate mixes for different uses. So you want to make sure if you're buying something that's pre-mixed that you're using it for its intended purpose. For example, one with coarser soil may be for growing lawn, but it wouldn't be the best choice for a raised bed garden for vegetables. So you want to choose a mix that has good nutrient and water holding capacity. If the framing material is sitting on top of the native soil, then you can dig the first 6 inches or so down and actually frame your bed into the ground and have a little bit of that underneath. And you can mix the native soil into your soil mix as you fill in the bed. This is called double digging, and this is an option, but it will loosen the soil for deeper plant root growth. So if you're trying to grow things that maybe need a little bit deeper soil, this is recommended. And then doing a soil test after you've got your beds in place is usually a really good idea. So you know where your nutrient level lies, and you can add that fertilization as needed. So just being cognizant of where your soil comes from and knowing where your compost comes from and how it was composted, what was treated in, things like that, can be important, but having a good mixture of like topsoil and a mixture of the organic matter, mixing that together can create a pretty good base for your raised bed soil. Then we want to look at once your beds are in, what are you going to do now? So whether you're using organic or synthetic fertilizers, you do want to keep in mind that if you're using your raised beds to grow vegetables, these require a lot of nutrients. They do grow rapidly and they produce an entire plant and crop for harvest in only 25 to 100 days, depending on what you're growing, the variety, and its growth rate. So you want to be sure that you're applying enough nitrogen, phosphate, and potash to feed the plants properly. Pale green plants are the ones that are often craving nitrogen and will probably appear more often in raised beds than in a conventional garden. As nitrogen, you want to add nitrogen as it's needed during the growing season, and this can be done through fertigation or side dressing. And then let's look at irrigation. You want to think about how to properly keep your plants growing. You want to keep them watered, and then you want to think about what your watering system is and how often that's going to take you. The mixture of soil and organic matter in raised beds does dry out faster than your traditional soils. So on the other hand, the soil is loose, so it does absorb that water faster. Soaker hoses or upside down sprinkler hoses can be used to good advantage. So thinking about low pressure, when you're looking at watering, they will apply water right where you want it along each row. And then keep in mind that raised beds will heat up and cool down more quickly compared to your in-ground beds. For year-round gardeners and for gardeners growing perennial vegetables, the higher the raised bed, the more frost protection it will require during cool nights. So just be cognizant of all of those decisions and make sure you're watering your plants as they need it throughout the season. Then looking at maintenance of the beds and the walkways. So once the shaping or forming is finished, you want to keep traffic in the pathways and don't step in or on your raised beds. This can cause compaction for your nicely planted beds. You also can place stakes at the corners of your unframed beds. As you can see in the right here, there's a stake on the corners. And this actually helps to prevent damage as you're watering or as you're pulling things through to prevent that hose from dragging on and damaging your plants or even degrading the bed structure as you're moving through. Organic matter decomposes and disappears, so adding more of it can be something that's needed. And so just being cognizant of maybe having an organic compost pile where you can add some of that soil back in to have that organic matter. And then use compost to provide nutrients during the summer is an option. Cover the beds with 2 inches of leaves or other organic material in the wintertime. And this material is pretty well decomposed by spring and planting can proceed on schedule. You want to keep your walkways as dry as possible. And this will help control weeds as well as not making you have a big mud puddle when you're trying to walk through and work in harvest in your garden. Adding wood chips, as you see in one of my photos, and bark and paving stones are different options that you can add to put paths between your beds. This also helps with the water buildup and mud issues that may happen from watering or leaks that may spurt in your watering system. So another option is to fill the walkways with leaves when they are available. So if you have trees and things on your property, you can recycle those here. This is a great, it'll create a trench of composted material also that you could later rake up onto your beds and just kind of be putting it back into the soil. Once the beds have gone through the improvement process, rototilling should be unnecessary. Once you've done it, you've gotten the garden soil pretty well figured out, and it's going to be a little easier in the following seasons. Conditions may not be ideal yet in the first spring. following bed construction, but a light spading or forking will create a suitable seed bed. So once you've put in the hard work, usually each year after that, it's not necessarily as hard. As you keep adding more loosening material, you will be able to garden almost all year. So as you can see, you can also cover the beds to create a little bit longer season for season extension. If you want more information on that, please reach out to me. There will be a statewide webinar in June, I think it is, that talks a little bit about winter vegetables. And then later in the year, we have a statewide webinar that's going to be talking about season extension. So I'm happy to share those resources with you as well, if that's something that you're wanting to look into. Earlier planting will also be possible because the improved drainage creates a better environment for the plants. It also promotes faster warming of the soil and more rapid growth in the early season. At the end of the season, better drainage means healthier plants that will continue yielding longer. The walkways can provide better footing if it does rain in the fall. You're more likely to harvest cool season crops with less mud to battle. So just be thinking about those things as you're planning out your season and what you plan to grow. Most home gardeners can garden with high intensity. There's growing a lot more plants in a dense amount. So planting more stuff in a smaller space. So by doing this, you can use different methods. Trellising is an option. One of our master gardeners has created a trellis in one of our demonstration gardens. This requires less growing space and allows them to trail up instead of across the soil surface. Making raised beds that stair step is another option that will allow for vertical positioning of plants, and that can also conserve space. Intercropping is where you plant 2 or more vegetables together in the same space. Many native cultures actually have done this traditionally throughout history, intercropping corn with beans and squash or pumpkins, and so kind of creating its own little ecosystem of growth. Another option that a lot of people use is the square foot gardening method. It is another type of intensive gardening, and the gardening area is laid off into a grid of 1 square foot sections, and each foot section is given a specific plant that grows there. And based on the plant needs, they may need more than 1 square foot for a plant. But it's very nice for intensive gardening. So you're trying to grow a lot in a little amount of space, you may want to look into that. Container gardening is also a way to garden intensively, and we will be looking at that a little bit more next week. So if you haven't signed up for our webinar next Monday, please go ahead and sign up and join us. We'd love to have you. Now, I didn't cover a lot of the crop information because we did discuss a lot of that in our beginner gardening class last week. But if you're new and this is your first one, this guide here, the Growing Your Own, has the dates for planting vegetables in Oregon on page 7. So if you would like the resource for that, please feel free to reach out to me or just search this online on our website and it will come up. It is a resource you can print or download on your computer to have access to. So thank you all again. My references are listed here. Most of the information that came in this presentation was from the Raised Bed Gardening publication that one of my fellow Master Gardener Program coordinators worked on. So Brooke Edmonds, shout out to you. Thank you for all of your lovely resources. If you're looking at trying to do season extension, you may want to check out how to build your own raised bed Cloche. And then other resources for growing stuff can be found on our publications resource site, which is listed at the bottom of my resources here. Again, my name is Andrea Stith. I'm the Community Horticulture Outreach and Master Gardener Program Coordinator for OSU Extension in Wasco County. You can email me questions at andrea.stith@oregonstate.edu, or we have the wonderful Master Gardeners that you can reach out to with gardening questions and get experts from the area to help answer your questions. You can reach the Master Gardener Plant Clinic at 541-296-1217 or email them at wasco.mastergardener@oregonstate.edu. We'd be happy to connect you with one of our local Master Gardeners to give you some wonderful information and help answer more questions. Thank you all. And if you would like to check out the Master Gardener's garden down on the riverfront walk in the Dalles, the Master Gardeners have some wonderful raised beds started down there. That is what is pictured in the background behind me here. I love their garden. They've been doing a lot of hard work down there. So if you want to have some learning experience, go down and see what they're doing to get some ideas. It is a public garden. We do welcome you to come down and check out and see what's going on in the demo garden. Thank you all and have a great day.